Representations of politics in video games is often a very touchy subject, as everyone has their own definition of what exactly that means. Some decry anything remotely political, while others argue that art will always be political in some way. No matter which side of the argument you land on, chances are Ubisoft has pissed you off at some point. As usual with its upcoming title Far Cry 6, the company has drawn criticism over politics, only to immediately clarify its previous statements.
Oh no, I'm not brave enough for politics.
For context, Far Cry 6 is an upcoming open-world FPS set during a revolution on the fictional island of Yara, clearly inspired by Cuba and ruled by the sinister charms of Giancarlo Esposito in the role of a fascist dictator, Anton Castillo. Since this game is overtly about fascism, you might be wondering how this is possibly not political and open to any sort of interpretation. Speaking with outlet The Gamer last week, narrative director Navid Kavari discussed how the game draws inspiration from real-life guerrilla warfare, while avoiding any of the specifics of history. The team spoke to real guerrilla fighters who were active during the 50s and 60s and how that influenced the game's events without retelling the real-world events. We also fell in love with the culture and people we met. When we came out of that, it wasn't that we felt we had to do Cuba, we realised it's a complicated island and our game doesn't want to make a political statement about what's happening in Cuba specifically. Beyond that, we're drawing inspiration from guerrilla movements around the world and throughout history. For us, it felt like doing the island of Yara would help us tell that story while being very open with our politics and inspiration. Apparently, Kavari's comments have got people confused, and I'd put a lot of the blame for that on the media and people just misreading things like they always do on the internet. He says they don't want to make something political about Cuba specifically, rather than not making anything political. This is a perfectly fair take as far as I'm concerned. Before reading the story myself, I was under the impression that they explicitly said it's not political at all, which just isn't the case, and this quote is pretty clear to me. The interview where I took that quote from by The Gamer actually started with a very different, much more misleading headline. What makes the situation funny to me is that it's always the exact same song and dance with Ubisoft and how they try to have their cake and eat it. It's always our game isn't political, it just features overt political themes and overdone tropes. At least this time the director actually came out and said it in black and white that the game is political. Of course, Ubisoft knows all of this is controversial and it's all part of the plan to keep the media wheels spinning and increasing the game's exposure. Of course they know it's political. They know some will love that, they know some will hate that, so they lean heavily into that conversation to keep the debate going, all the while seeing more exposure and more pre-orders. Even though this is obviously a political game, it's still pretty surface level stuff that anyone can understand. Dictatorship equals bad. Granted, that assumption is before the game has come out, and I don't know what the story is or how well it is told, but it is Ubisoft, so I don't really have much faith in it trying anything remotely thought-provoking. To give you a very quick recap of Cuba's revolutionary history, the nation went through a bloody revolution between 1953 and 1959 against the military dictatorship led by Fulgencio Batista, resulting in a new communist regime led by Fidel Castro. The situation is made all the more complicated by the US's involvement, which sided with Batista and caused several significant events during the Cold War, like the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, that was a very brief snapshot of Cuba's very complicated political history, and there is so much more to it, but you can read up on that yourself. No doubt the US's involvement in Cuba's history plays a huge role in Ubisoft's fickle political alignment, and why they're constantly walking on eggshells. The company is far too big and commercial to tackle anything specific and must exist on mass appeal, so potentially alienating part of the audience by criticizing any part of Cuba's history is out of the question for them, and such is their right. Not every game needs to have overt political themes about the real world. Ubisoft can make whatever games it wants with whatever political themes it wants. As far as I'm concerned, if the creators want to do that, then let them, and if you don't like it, don't buy it. It's really that simple. If, for whatever reason, you don't like that this game features a lot of stuff heavily inspired by the real world events in Cuba, then don't buy it. The power is literally in your hands. Vote with your wallet and don't buy things that you don't like. The root of my issues with the whole politics in games debate is telling creators what they should or shouldn't make, which I object to. Creators should make what they like, and whatever sells, sells. Let the market decide. People can read and interpret a text, i.e. a game, in a number of different ways. Some people will always see politics or allegory, whether it was deliberately placed there by the creator or not, while some just won't see any of that stuff. So, after trying to dodge the political quagmire, Kavari has amended his statement with a blog post that opens boldly with the line, "Our story is political. It continues a story about a modern revolution must be. There are hard, relevant discussions in Far Cry 6 about the conditions that lead to the rise of fascism in a nation, the costs of imperialism, forced labor, the need for free and fair elections, LGBTQ+ rights, and more within the context of Yara, a fictional island in the Caribbean. My goal was to empower our team to be fearless in the story we were telling, and we worked incredibly hard to do this over the last 5 years. We also tried to be very careful about how we approached our inspirations, which include Cuba, but also other countries around the world that have experienced political revolutions in their histories. Maybe I'm too cynical and my general distaste of Ubisoft is creating a bias, but I just don't see a world where Ubisoft is a company that can handle any of the listed hard, relevant discussions in a way that doesn't come across as half-arsed or self-congratulatory. That said, Kavari does claim to be speaking from experience of a revolutionary country. The conversations and research done on the perspectives of those who fought revolutions in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and beyond are absolutely reflected in our story and characters. But if anyone is seeking a simplified, binary political statement specifically on the current political climate in Cuba, they won't find it. I am from a family that has endured the consequences of revolution. I have debated revolution over the dinner table my entire life. I can only speak for myself, but it is a complex subject that should never be boiled down to one quote. I do particularly like that last line about things being boiled down to one quote, because that is exactly what has happened with this whole discussion, and I fully believe this is what Ubisoft intended. He is saying the right things here about not being a black and white political situation representing the real political landscape of Cuba. Similarly, descriptions of the game's villain, the dictator Anton Castillo, sound really good on paper. But then I remember this is Ubisoft and they've not made a story that I've connected with in years. And let's just remember that all this is it political, is it not political nonsense is part of the marketing plan. This conversation always happens and always follows the same beats, and Ubisoft is letting that happen to keep the media coverage going because they'll gain more sales than they lose. This is why I hate the politics in games discussion online, because it's always the same thing round and round and round again, where the media and gamers are eating each other to no real end. Discussing this with a real person can be a really interesting debate where you both come out having learned something meaningful. But of course, on the internet, none of this happens because subtlety and nuance just don't exist. Nonetheless, if you don't think Far Cry is political, especially this one, then you are a fool. However, that doesn't mean you have to like the politics, and certainly doesn't mean you have to buy it. All in all, conversations like this bug me because it's never conducive to making good games, which is all that really matters here. Is the game good? If yes, awesome, let's go topple a dictatorship with an adorable disabled dog named Chorizo. If no, fine, move along, next please. Let developers make the games they want and let gamers play the games they want. The game is political, but doesn't specifically refer to Cuba or criticize anything from the real world in particular. It's a pretty easy concept to grasp, but that seems to be completely lost in the discussions I've seen on Twitter. Ah yeah, but let's remember it is Twitter, which is even more toxic than any real world revolution. I thought it was obvious from Kavari's first quote, but reading comprehension is in short supply on the internet. Just like all culture war stuff, this all seems so manufactured and the same talking points are repeated over and over, which is exactly what Ubisoft want, and that's how they market these things. Even talking about this means I'm part of the problem. This was meant to form part of a daily dribble, but ended up running too long. Ironically, it's a conversation I don't really like having on the internet, but I have lots to say, because you can't really talk about it properly on the internet. Anyway, that's enough from me for now. Let devs make the games they want, and don't buy them if you don't like them. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. Join us on Patreon if you fancy it over at patreon.com/prettygoodgaming. I've been Henry Cooper. This has been Pretty Good Gaming. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.